Hello and welcome to your introductory video on the vestibular system. I don't know about you, but I had not heard about the vestibular system until I got into studying neurology. Now, if you've had vestibular issues, you know what the vestibular system does and why it matters, because when it goes haywire, we have big problems. So I just today want to talk about what it is, what it does, and why you should care. And I just want to say, you don't have to know any of this, right? We're going to do the drills to train the vestibular system, and it's going to work whether you understand any of this or not. But I don't know, for me personally, knowing how the anatomy works helps me understand why I'm doing the drills a bit better, and certainly gives it more saliency. So you can watch this video before we do the drills or after or multiple times, because yes, this is neurology. It's a little deep. I'm going to make this as simple as we possibly can. It is a complicated system and it connects to just about everything in the nervous system. So just know this is, very surface level, but I am happy to answer any questions that come up for you. So I actually want to start with what the vestibular system does. Why do we have this? And let me just start by saying, actually, the vestibular system is the first system that develops embryonically, which I think is so fascinating. It's also the first system to myelinate, meaning we create more faster, super strong connections in utero. So this is all happening, as you are gestating in your mother. We're already bouncing around in there, right? Swimming around. And that vestibular system is developing. So when we come out, it is actually quite fully formed, as opposed to some of the other elements of the brain that require, life in order to develop. The other piece that I find super interesting from like an evolutionary perspective is that our vestibular system, the way it's created, is very similar to any other life form that moves on Earth. So it's a very elegant, somewhat complex system, but has been around a long time. It is tried and true, and I think that's pretty cool too. So the vestibular system's job is to answer two questions. One is, which direction is up? AKA, where is the ground so my head doesn't hit it? And two, which direction am I going? Also, what speed am I moving? So it's basically assuring that we don't fall down and that we know where we are as we move through the world. Pretty cool, very important. And yeah, we think about the vestibular system, it's your onboard balance system. We all know balance is important, but it usually gets kind of categorized in this anti-fall campaign, right? We don't want to fall down. Falling, obviously, it's like the second or third leading cause of death. So obviously that's a big deal and a primary concern, but it is not the only thing that the vestibular system is doing. And when we understand some of the other things that it is doing, it can paint a bigger picture on what we may want to think about in terms of preventing falls. So what I find fascinating is that maybe the number one job of the vestibular system is that it helps us see clearly when we move. So we're going to look at the anatomy in a little bit, but your vestibular system lives in your inner ear, directly in line with your eyes, and they are closely linked. We're going to do drills that combine the two of them together, and there's a bunch of reasons for that. But that I just find super fascinating. It's really important to be able to see clearly while we move, and it is your vestibular system's job to make sure that is happening. So when we are in class, I'm going to often have us use our little brain pens here because there's letters on it, and we can actually judge whether or not we are able to keep our vision clear while we are doing our vestibular drill. So if I'm moving, can I actually keep that target clear? That's going to give us some information about how well the vestibular system is functioning and or how well it's communicating with the visual system. But that is actually one of its primary purposes. The fourth thing I want to talk about is the vestibular system's role in posture. And we looked at spinal lengthening and the impact that that has on just about everything. Well, your vestibular system plays a key role in creating spinal tone. Largely, it's communicating to the extensors on the back chain of our body, right? The back, the spinal extensors, the glutes, the hamstrings, your calves, right? So it is setting the tone for how upright we actually are. So if I don't know which direction up is quite accurately, there's no way I can set that tone in a balanced way. So it's having this downstream impact on all of the musculature in our body. Think about that for a second. So we're talking about, yes, fall prevention, right? If I can't figure out which direction up is and I'm swaying all over the place, yes, that makes me more vulnerable to a fall. And it's going to impact the grace and the strength and the flexibility of my movement as I move through the world, right? So if I'm looking to get faster, if I'm looking to get stronger, if I'm looking to improve any element of movement, I need to include my vestibular system in the conversation. Super, super powerful to think about. Number 5, your vestibular system is deeply connected to your autonomic nervous system. So your vestibular system plays a role in blood pressure, in pulse, in respiration. How much are you breathing? Are you breathing low into your belly? Is it a shallow breath, right? So if you think about this, if my vestibular system is designed to tell me if I'm moving and where I'm moving and at what speed I'm moving, doesn't it make sense then that it would play a role in my autonomics, right? If I'm moving quickly, then I'm gonna need a higher pulse. I'm gonna need higher blood pressure, right? If I'm moving quickly up a hill, I'm gonna need more autonomic response to rev the engines to get me up that hill or away from the tiger, right? If you've ever had POTS, or if you know somebody that has or tachycardia or something where one of your autonomic systems goes out of whack, it is a very strange experience to be eating breakfast and your heart is pounding like crazy. We have a tendency in this culture to think about playing with our autonomics from a nutritional perspective, right? It always seems to come back to diet. I'm just not eating the right amounts of things. And yes, absolutely, the biochemistry of nutrition can play a role, but so can your vestibular system. So if you have blood pressure issues, if you have respiratory issues, right, it is worth looking at the vestibular system to see what kind of impact it can have. This actually extends even further. The vestibular system, we now know, directly connects to the hypothalamus, which is your endocrine system. So hormones. So if there is anything going on for you with hormones, we also may want to look at the vestibular system and see what kind of impact we can have from that perspective. And interestingly, we now know that the vestibular system plays a huge role in osteoporosis and in scoliosis. So this is fascinating. We talked about the vestibular system being huge in postural control. If my vestibular system is off balance, especially during periods of high growth, like during puberty, and I'm laying down bone with a system that is not quite balanced, I can end up with formation changes in my spine. And yes, there are some links to osteoporosis and potentially having an impact on that. There's a bit more research that needs to be done to figure it out, but it is related. We know that. And then finally, if you think about its impact on the autonomic system and on the endocrine system, it probably doesn't make it's probably not that surprising or big of a leap to think about the fact that it also can support immunity. That's a big deal for me, certainly in the world at the moment, right? If we want to have as much resiliency as possible as we show up in the world, in terms of health and staying healthy, our vestibular system plays a huge role in this. So I often, if I'm fighting a cold or feeling like I'm run down, will turn to my vestibular system and make sure I'm getting as much vestibular activation as I can. And it does have an impact. It's pretty cool. I also think there is an element, if we're talking about sinus pieces or inflammation, right? Inflammation can wreak havoc on the vestibular system. So it's kind of a two-way street in my mind, right? Like if I'm starting to get inflammation or symptoms like a cold, that might impact the vestibular system. But then if I'm working the vestibular system, it can help support immunity, the clearing of those things. So I think about it kind of both ways, but super cool. Also, because the vestibular system is so closely linked to the cerebellum, If you are interested in improving coordination, accuracy, in addition to balance, and I'm talking coordination and accuracy of movement, but also of thought, then we want to look at the vestibular system for that as well. So hopefully this gives you a big picture of why training your vestibular system might be a good idea. So now let's take a look at the anatomy of the vestibular system and we'll see what's going on. All right, so this is your vestibular system. Let's take a look at these different pieces of the anatomy and we can talk about each one a little bit in detail. Just a reminder, your vestibular system lives inside your inner ear. It is not in the canal, it's set inside bone. You cannot poke it with a Q-tip. So it's quite deep and it is, like I said, in line with your eyes so that they can communicate as efficiently as possible. It is made up of 5 different organelles. I did this because there's 5 on each side. There are 3 semicircular canals. Those are the little round bits there. Those connect into some lumpy bits. Those are your otolith organs, which I'll talk about. One is the saccule, one is the utricle. And then off of that, you can see the little snail-shaped tube. That is your cochlea. That is your auditory nerve. So the nerve that innervates the vestibular system is called the vestibulocochlear nerve. They are connected. So we're not going to talk too much about hearing in this video, but if you have hearing loss, it will impact your vestibular system. So for those of you who went to a lot of loud rock concerts, have been around loud noises, or are over the age of 40 and are starting to lose frequencies, that auditory loss can have an impact on vestibular function. So that's important to remember. All right, let's talk about these different organelles and what they do. We're going to start with these semicircular canals. There are 3 of them on each side, and they sit at 90-degree angles to each other. So if you take your fingers and you point straight ahead, there's 1. If you stick your fingers up your thumbs up like they're guns, there's 2. And then if your middle fingers point at each other, you've got 3. So 3 different semicircular canals at 90-degree angles to each other. They actually sit not directly perpendicular to each other. They're on a rotated angle like this. And this is important because when we go to train these semicircular canals, I'm going to have us move on diagonals, and that's why, okay? So those are the semicircular canals. How do they work? Well, they are filled with fluid. You've got this this circle happening here, filled with fluid, and at the bottom is this little round thing. This is called the ampulla. Inside the ampulla is a little sail-shaped piece of anatomy called the cupula. It looks like a little cup, I guess. And it's like this, it's like a little sail, and then out of the bottom of it is a hair of this cochlear, the vestibular nerve coming up into it. So just so we're saying the fluid's moving to the right, it's gonna bend the cupula and it's going to create a physical shift in this vestibular nerve here, which then gets sent to the brain to be integrated with the information from the other side, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, so semicircular canals, we've got fluid flowing through it. The speed at which you move impacts the speed of the fluid, and that is going to get recorded into the signal that goes down the nerve. So that's important because I'm going to have you try and move your head as quickly as you can in one direction. And that's why, right? We're trying to spin the fluid inside that semicircular canal. All right. So we've got these 3. We've got one that moves on the horizontal plane. We've got one that moves in a posterior direction and one that moves in an anterior direction. And I'm thinking about that just on one side for right now. The truth is they work in tandem. Like I said, it is a communication between the right and left. And I'm just going to take a minute here and talk about how this works. So if I'm staring straight in front of me, and everything is functioning correctly, I should have a signal coming from my right vestibular system and a signal coming from my left vestibular system, and they should match. Fun fact, we have like 18,000 nerve fibers per side in the vestibular system, and at rest we're getting like 1 million signals per second. So this is functioning, right, whether we are in movement or not. So here I am, 1 million and 1 million. If I were to rotate to the right, I am going to increase the signal coming from the right side. I'm going to decrease, hopefully the same amount, on the left side. And so my brain is getting this increase of signal on the right and a decrease of signal on the left. And assuming it matches, I now have information that tells my brain we're rotating to the right, okay? And ditto to the left, right? If I go to the left, it increases on the left, and it decreases on the right. Now, if something happens to my vestibular system, and just to say, right, I talked about the auditory piece of it, but any concussion, head injury can and usually does, I think it's like 60% of concussions have a vestibular impact long term if we don't retrain it. Some antibiotics can have a negative impact on the vestibular system. Lack of use movement-wise. So I talk a lot about the importance of three-dimensional movement in the work that we do, because if I'm not regularly getting doses of activation in these planes, and hello, we all live in boxes, none of us are getting enough, that lack of use can start to atrophy our vestibular system's ability to get accurate information about where we are in space. So let's say something has happened, okay? And let's say it's happened to my right ear. So I've got a deficit now happening in my right vestibular tone. If that's the case, I'm now here and here. I'm still at neutral. I've still got the million signals coming from my left ear, but I'm down to like 500,000 on my right. If I'm facing front and I'm getting this discrepancy, my brain is telling me that I have actually rotated to the left. Yes? Now, assuming your eyes are functioning okay, you're still getting feedback from your eyes, and your brain prioritizes information from your eyes. So you may not know that this is happening. I'm going to talk more about sensory mismatch, which is what we would call this, in another conversation, because it's super, super important. But for right now, right, I have a deficit in the right side and I'm normal on my left, which is then sending, because of the comparison, a signal to my brain telling me I have rotated to the left. But I have not, right? So what can happen is that I actually may have rotational tendencies to the right so that I actually get even. So whether or not, depending on what's going on with the eyes, that may not happen structurally, but we're getting this constant signal that tells us that we should rotate to the right in order to balance this out. And just to say, my right posterior canal is going to partner with my left anterior canal, right? So when we move into these diagonals, we're still having that same balancing conversation, ditto on the other side. And so we're playing with the balancing out of the left and right vestibular system. So anything we can do to recalibrate those instruments is going to be super beneficial. So now we're moving into these otolith organs. Otolith means ear stone, like literally. If you've ever met someone that's had a crystal out of place, vertigo, these crystals can, if we have too much inflammation, they can get dislodged and move into the semicircular canals. They're not supposed to be there. So there are crystals. So how do these otoliths work? They're little, containers, and inside the container is jello. And on top of the jello are rocks. It sounds like some grotesque 1980s dinner, dessert, something. But we've got jello with rocks on it. And then again, we've got these tentacles of the vestibular nerve sticking up into the jello. So if I am moving in a lateral plane, right? So again, the saccule is going to deal with vertical movement up and down. The utricle is going to deal with lateral movement side to side, forward and back. It also navigates head tilts, right? And it functions the same as the semicircular canals. I'm having a conversation between the right and the left side. So if I'm tilting to the right, the signal on the right is going up, the signal on the left is going down, right? Coming back to neutral, vice versa on this side. So those rocks are sliding across the jello. They're weighting it down, pulling that jello, which is pulling on those tentacles of the nerve, and we're getting that signal sent to the brain about the fact that we're moving and the speed with which we're moving. Now, the utricle and the saccule, the neurology behind it is quite complicated. They actually have their own internal calibration and different fibers laid down in different directions so that we can be really accurate about angles of movement, and super, super cool. We don't know how to train that necessarily yet, but in theory, the complexity of it feeds my enthusiasm about how amazing humans are. But yeah, so I'm gonna keep that part pretty simple. We're just gonna know the important pieces are that utricle moves us laterally, right, side to side, and that saccule moves us up and down. I like to say the utricle is like riding in a car, right? You can feel the acceleration forward or backwards. And if you're in an elevator, that's your saccule, moving things up and down, okay? So hopefully this gives you enough information to sort of lay the big picture down for why we want to train the vestibular system. And when we get to how to train the vestibular system, now you have a little bit of the anatomy to see why these drills look the way they do. If you have any questions on this, there's obviously like so many more layers of complexity to this, but so if you have any juicy questions, please ask. I'm happy to answer them to the best of my ability. And yes, I'm looking forward to playing with your vestibular systems and seeing what kind of changes we can make to your brain and to your body, into the way that you move your body through the world.